It is April 3rd, 2025, and China is now responding after the Trump administration announced plans for 54% tariffs or taxes, more realistically, on imports coming to the US from China. This is yet another reminder that the US is ramping up for war with China economically, as we're now seeing directly, and also militarily, with eyes on Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. As we saw this week, you have the Trump administration, or more specifically, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, really cozying up to Japan like never before. He's also the one who reportedly sent out a memo to the Pentagon last month telling them that they needed to prepare a strategy for the US to take on and win a war against China. So, what would that actually look like? Are we going to get to that point? And how is China responding to all of this as it is all out right here in the open? Well, we got into all of that with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is KJ No, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co-host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. KJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be with you.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get into the latest here. I know that President Trump announced a slew of tariffs on Wednesday, which brings the total, well, it's really a tax, but we'll call it a tariff on US imports from China up to 54%, and that is supposed to go into effect starting next week. Now, in response, China's Ministry of Commerce is threatening resolute countermeasures and accusing Trump of going against international trade rules and seriously undermining the legitimate rights and interests of relevant parties. So, how do you see Trump's actions here, and what are the major concerns when we're talking about a 54% tariff on imports coming from China?
I think they're going to be catastrophic unless these are simply the first moves, in a complex negotiation with all the countries of the world. We're going to see very, very rapidly negative effects. We've already seen the stock market lose 3%, trillions already. We can expect certainly consumer inflation because these tariffs are a tax on the consumer, a regressive tax on the consumer. And then over the long term, we could see a recession. And from a geostrategic viewpoint, the Chinese are not wrong. They say, they're urging us to immediately cancel these tariff measures and properly, negotiate, to resolve differences. But, they say that this will harm U.S. interests and endanger global economic development and global supply chains. I think they're absolutely right on that. Regarding China itself, China will manage. It will simply pivot away from exporting to the United States. That's U.S. is only 15% of China's, exports to U.S. are only 15% of their GDP. And in fact, if you look at the trade surplus, it's only 3% of GDP. So they expect that even if these tariffs go on full bore against China, China will lose maybe 0.5 or 1% of GDP growth. That's not great, but it's not terrible. China will still have 4 or 4.5% GDP growth, and it can live with that. But from the standpoint of your average American consumer, your average working class person, they will be taxed to the range of about $3,400 to $4,500. That's the loss that they will see immediately. And so this is a huge, huge blow to the American working class. And the other thing I want to point out is that tariffs are like building a wall around your economy. Now, it's great if you build. It's not great, but the theory is that if you build a wall around a single country, you have enclosed them. But if you build a wall around the entire world, guess what's happened? You've enclosed yourself. And the other countries simply trade with each other. And in the meantime, the US will have closed itself off from global trade and all the benefits that it has had from that so far.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And it makes me wonder too. I mean, I look at Trump and I know he seems to love tariffs. Then again, it's an action he can take himself, right? He doesn't have to go through the US Congress. He gets to just decide, oh, we're going to slap this tariff on that country and do whatever we want here. And he is certainly doing that, acting a little bit like a king in that way. And we also see him targeting a number of different countries. That includes the island of Taiwan, not a country, but apparently under the Trump administration it is. And you now have Taiwan responding, criticizing the Trump administration, saying that 32% tariffs are unreasonable and that it was actually the US tech curbs on China during Trump's first term that drove the trade imbalance. Now, I thought that the US was trying to, further trade with Taiwan as they arm them to the teeth, that they were trying to decouple from China, but yet it seems like the US is harming all of its friends and also itself. How do you see the road that the Trump administration is currently going down, especially when it comes to relations with Taiwan?
Well, I think it's very confusing for everybody, including the Chinese leadership, including all of US allies. I mean, of course, there are the 34% tariffs on China, but there are 24% tariffs on Japan, 25% tariffs on Korea, 20% tariffs on the EU, 46% tariffs on Vietnam, and then Madagascar has the highest tariffs, of the entire bunch, as if, what have they ever done to us? I think it goes back to the formula. Trump says that this is about creating reciprocity or fairness in tariffs, but what it is really based on is the Trump administration has taken the surplus, that country's surplus with the United States, as the numerator, and they've taken the total exports to the US as a denominator, turned that into a ratio, and halved it. And this formula makes absolutely no sense. Nobody's able to make head or tail out of why they would do something this, foolish in terms of economy and in terms of, reciprocal trade. It just doesn't make any sense. Your average country has about, 7%, 7.5% tariffs against the United States. Well, then impose 7.5% tariffs. But that's not the case. We're talking double digits in most cases, many of them US allies. And so I think that signals a couple of different things. First is that it seems that Trump, as you point out, is absolutely in love with tariffs. He says it's a word that is more beautiful than love, right? I think that, he really is about mercantilism, neo-mercantilism, about protectionism. He really wants these tariffs. I think that it's a way of offloading or justifying the reduction in corporate taxes and individual taxes and offloading that tax burden into regressive indirect consumer taxes, which is what tariffs are. And it also signals that there's a kind of divergence between what Trump is doing economically and what Trump or his administration, Hegseth and the others, are trying to do geostrategically, which is bring their allies together to, create, a collaborative, cooperative force to wage war against China. And on the other hand, he's certainly alienating and shocking most of them with these punitive tariffs that are not only going to hurt the United States, but are going to seriously damage the interests of these countries that are supposed to be US allies, most notably Taiwan, because that trade imbalance is because the US is buying Taiwanese semiconductors.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that Trump is proceeding in this way, right? I don't quite understand it. I don't know that, plenty of the people around him do either. I do want to switch gears a little bit to talk about some other things that the Trump administration is up to also regarding China, because there was this reported memo that was leaked earlier this week, which was sent by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth last month. Now, this is according to the Washington Post. They said that the memo ordered the Pentagon to plan for the execution of Trump's vision to prepare for and win a potential war against Beijing and to defend the United States from threats in the near abroad, including Greenland and the Panama Canal. Now, I want to get your reaction on this memo first and foremost, because it's no secret that the US is not winning the war that they're currently fighting against Russia. So, what's to say that they can really take on and win a war against China?
Rachel, I hate to say this, but there was a YouGov poll a few years back. It polled 224 adults. And among these people who were polled, 6% of them, including 7% of adult males, said that they could beat a grizzly bear in hand to hand combat,
Right.
right? I think that this is the same kind of delusion. There's no way that the United States can win a war against China, against a peer competitor. And it's been amply demonstrated right now that the US was directly fighting against Russia. It was, picking targets, the US weapons, US intelligence. It was quite literally fighting against Russia, and it lost. And that's why you're seeing all this discourse about, oh, the Ukrainians didn't do what we told them to, that's why we're losing. But the key part is that the US is acknowledging that it has lost or is losing this war against Russia. If it can't win a war against Russia, which it considers to be a gas station masquerading as a country, what makes them think that they can win a war against a real peer competitor who has tremendous, tremendous economic power, and economic power is commensurate with military power? And the other thing to remember is that if it comes to Taiwan, China wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan. It's very, very clear about that. It sees the people on Taiwan Island as family, as compatriots. It does not want to shed the blood of its own family, its own compatriots. But it's also understood that China is ready for this. China has prepared for this. It's like that line from Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee said, I do not fear the man who has rehearsed 10,000 techniques. I fear the man who has trained one technique 10,000 times. That one technique, 10,000 times rehearsed, is Taiwan's recuperation or blockade or prevention from it becoming a threat to China, because Taiwan is a serious threat to China. It always has been. It's been a threat since the 1940s, 1945. Japan tried to invade China from Taiwan. The KMT waged war against China from Taiwan Island. The US had plans to nuke China from Taiwan Island, 1950s, in the 1960s, the single integrated operational plans. These were all plans where they placed nuclear weapons on Taiwan Island, preparing to destroy 60 to 70% of China's cities from Taiwan Island. So Taiwan poses an existential threat. And as I've said before, if you have a family member who locks themselves in their room, you can tolerate it. You'll give them food, you'll give them water, you'll take care of them. But if they lock themselves in their room or in the basement and they start stockpiling weapons, guns, gasoline, and explosives, how long will you tolerate it before you have to interdict what they're taking in, and perhaps disarm them? That's the situation that China is facing right now. And that's why you see this, flurry of heightened activity around Taiwan. Taiwan has literally come out saying, the Taiwan leadership, not the Taiwan people, but the DPP Taiwan leadership, William Lai, has come out and designated China as a hostile foreign force. And it's attempting to pass 17 measures to prevent any de-escalation or any peaceful reunification, including the implementation of military tribunals to prosecute anybody who is friendly with China. And so I think that there are tectonic shifts that are happening, and China is cautiously trying to prevent this, and also signaling to the United States, please do not engage in war with us over Taiwan. Taiwan is an internal affair. It's none of your business, and it will be a losing battle.
Yeah, and as you're pointing it out there, and I know this is something that you've been talking about for a while, it reminds me of what the US did with Ukraine, right? Where they got Ukraine to this point where it was saying Russia's the problem, right? We want NATO membership. And they just keep going on poking the bear. And it's like, what do you think is eventually going to happen? There has to be some sort of a response at some point. Now, when it comes to the Trump administration, I know that, some people look at him and they say, hey, he said that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, right? He doesn't want World War III with Russia. Maybe he's even, putting Russia aside and focusing entirely on China. But what's interesting to me is that in that memo from Pete Hegseth, it says that the Pentagon plans to assume risk in other theaters given personnel and resource constraints and to pressure allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to spend more on defense to take on the bulk of the quote unquote deterrence role against threats from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Now, this of course comes as Pete Hegseth already told his European counterparts in February that they needed to step up their support for the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine so that the US could focus solely on China. And now we also see Hegseth declaring that the US and Japan are constituting a joint force headquarters in Japan. Is that part of the overall plan? And how do you see the fact that Pete Hegseth, I mean, this guy who literally was the Fox and Friends weekend anchor, is now suddenly at the forefront of leading the charge on U.S. foreign policy, and it does not look like we're going in a good direction.
It does not look like we're going in a good direction. It's like the trade tariffs. This is more foolishness, if not outright insanity. For a while there was a hope amongst people that we might be retrenching a little bit. We might be dialing down these constant foreign engagements, these constant wars. Doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem like we're moving towards restraint, but rather towards a prioritization. And that prioritization, as Brian Berletic has said, is simply a reallocation, a division of labor. This language Peter Hegseth and others have used, this is a division of labor. We will be pulling out of the Ukraine theater and prioritizing our forces to fight China in the Pacific. So there's a clear continuity as well as a certain type of consolidation of force. And all of that, again, speaks to the incredible foolishness of attempting to wage a war against a country that is not posing a threat to us. Certainly, China poses absolutely no threat to the average American citizen. It does pose a threat to those who believe in unipolar global hegemony and the benefits they think that confers them. That is the ruling imperial class. But this notion that they can go to war and defeat China, as I said, this is the grizzly bear fallacy. But we see this happening in many different ways. As you point out, it's the process of Ukrainizing of Taiwan against the will of its own people with this quisling proxy government on Taiwan Island by porcupining it and packing it full of weapons and filling it with long range standoff missiles and platforms. But the other thing which is very, very disturbing and I think has been underemphasized is that when Hegseth went to Japan and he met with the Japanese defense minister, he said that our Defense Department has started phase one of upgrading U.S. forces Japan to a joint force headquarters. This will improve our ability to coordinate operations with Japan's own Joint Operations Command. Okay, what this means, if you unpack it, is that they're going to create a military command structure, which is very similar to South Korea. In South Korea, the U.S. and South Korea have a joint command. And when we say joint command, it means that the U.S. is really in control. It's like Japan will be the junior partner, as is Korea in the joint command. It's the junior partner. In Korea, the United States has operational control over South Korea's 500,000 active duty troops plus 3.1 million reserve troops, 3.6 million troops that it can get at the drop of a hat, because all it needs to do is declare the magic words DEFCON 3, and then it becomes automatically, the commander of all of these combined forces. And my estimation is that the U.S. is setting Japan up for the same type of structure. That is, it's going to have a joint command where the U.S. controls the Japanese army, and this has been actually a four-step process. First, during the Obama administration, they encouraged Japan to remilitarize, and then during after that, they encouraged Japan to sign agreements that would allow the Japanese JSDF forces to fight with the United States anytime the US goes to war. And then more recently, Ishiba has agreed to double Japan's military budget. That would put it into the stratosphere. It would have possibly the third largest military budget on the planet. It's already the fourth most powerful military, but it would have the third largest military budget on the planet after China and the US. And then the fourth piece of this is to quote unquote create this joint command, which really is a way of saying that the US, as it escalates to war, is setting up the conditions where it can unilaterally control Japan's military forces as well as South Korea's military forces, which it already can. And then you can see all the other, trilateral and minilateral alliances that's built, AUKUS, JACUS, JAFUS, etc. All of these things are being stitched together into a pan-Asian NATO, which is preparing for war.
Wow, that is incredibly concerning, right? I look at that and I go, no, this is not what the American people want. This is not something that I would argue the media here in this country is actually communicating to the American people about what their government is doing. The last thing I wanted to ask you is about China's response to all of this, right? Because we did see the Chinese military announced large scale drills in the waters and airspace around Taiwan this week that included an aircraft carrier battle group. But when they're watching everything play out, they're watching what the US did to and continues to do to Russia. And then they're watching this new version of NATO popping up all around them. How do you view the position that Beijing is in right now with the kind of patience that they're handling this with to a certain extent, making it clear, hey, we do not want war, but also what do those red lines look like for them when there comes a point of no return and they feel like they have to respond directly to the United States?
Well, the reddest of red lines is Taiwan Island, and the language that is currently coming out of the DoD and the language that seems to be coming out of the Taiwan authorities themselves, very likely encouraged by the United States, is a red line. And so, how will China respond? The Chinese have said, we are ready for whatever you will throw at us, be it economic war or kinetic war. They have literally come out and said that. And as I said, once again, China has the advantage of proximity and the fact that it sees Taiwan as a strategic risk, an existential risk, as well as part of its core interests. It's part of the unresolved chiastic history of its civil war. Without US intervention, Taiwan would already be part of China. And without Japanese intervention, the Japanese are also, part of this war coalition. The Japanese stole Taiwan Island from Japan in 1894 as war booty, as they were preparing to colonize the entire Asia Pacific. And so from them, it's unresolved history, it's civil war, leftover. It's like, the US troops that went to Galveston Island and then, we're still trying to hold out. That's how the Chinese see it. But also, it is a strategic and existential threat to China, which is why China will try to neutralize it. Clearly, what they will do is they will implement a blockade and see if they can gently get the Taiwan government to step down from its incredibly belligerent and foolish stance, they've also showed that they're capable of knocking out the fuel storage tanks in Taiwan Island. Taiwan has about 2 weeks worth of natural gas if there's a blockade, but China has shown that it can knock that out, in an instant. So it won't even have 2 weeks; it'll have 2 hours. So I think China's response is to signal that it is capable of taking military action, which will be extraordinarily disadvantageous to both their compatriots on Taiwan Island as well as the United States. It's not a war that the US can win unless it goes nuclear, which it may be planning already. And on the other hand, and this is the larger, big picture strategic action of China is simply building out relations with all the other countries in the global south. It's through the BRI and BRICS and other groupings, SCO, etc. And this is analogous to what Chairman Mao did when they were fighting the civil war against the KMT. They referred to it as encircling the cities from the countryside, simply building relations, building goodwill among all the peasants in the countryside, and then eventually encircling the cities and then defeating them. So if you want to give it a kind of a game analogy, the Chinese play this game called Go or Wei Qi. And the object of Go is connect in order to live, which is very different from the game of chess, which is what Western strategists think of. Chess is position and capture in order to kill. Position in order to kill, whereas the game of Go is you connect in order to live. I think that's China's approach. They're building connections, building relations, creating win-win relations and development with all the countries of the global south, in the hope that eventually the US too will see the benefits of cooperating and will join the multilateral order that is being built out, rather than simply trying to snuff out and control and kill off any challengers.
And I would hope that the US would get to that. I know I'm certainly not the most optimistic when it comes to some of the things that we're seeing from Washington as a whole, whether it be the Biden administration, now the Trump administration. They speak very similarly on a number of these big topics, but I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. KJ No, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co-host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.